Everyone, and welcome back. So today we are going to continue our discussion about commas, and I just want to review what we've talked about so far. So in the last video we talked about separating items in a list of 3 or more. As an example, Ellen went to the movies, a restaurant, and a nightclub. So 3 things there: movies, restaurants, and nightclub. I will say here a movie theater just so that they're kind of worded the same way. That's called parallelism. You don't need to know that term right now, but that's fine. Theater, comma, restaurant, comma, and nightclub. So we have all 3 of those words, comma after theater and comma after restaurant, to separate those items out a little bit. We also talked about how you have 2 or more adjectives describing a noun. You use a comma to separate those items as well. So kind of the same idea as above. It's just a tiny bit different, because if we had Ellen just doing 2 things, Ellen went to a restaurant and a nightclub. If she's just doing 2 things, I don't need the comma. But here, when things are describing a noun, it can become kind of difficult. I'm going to put a space there. It can be kind of difficult to understand what the person's saying. So we want that comma, that brief pause, right, in between the items. So let's go with Ellen again. Ellen had a set of old, dusty books from her grandmother. Old and dusty, describe the books. What kind of books are they? They're old and they're dusty. And we have a comma in between to kind of separate those things. There we go. Now you can kind of see that better. Old, dusty books from her grandmother. Great. Our third use for the comma, we talked about this before as well. You use a comma before a fanboy's conjunction. Now, fanboy's conjunctions are also called coordinating, because they're bringing things together. They're helping you combine 2 sentences. So sometimes a comma is used on its own to separate thoughts, words, or ideas. Sometimes it's used to join things correctly when there are other words. So here, fanboys stands for and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. And I don't use nor very often, so I'll give an example of that now, and I'm going to stick with Ellen. Ellen did not want to go to the gym, comma, nor did she want to go to work. Okay, so we have a comma before the nor, correctly combining those 2 thoughts. Our fourth use is using a comma after a dependent clause. So a dependent clause we've talked about a number of times. If you're not sure, please go back and watch the first thing on commas, or my lectures on dependent clause fragments, or my lectures on complex sentences. So we've talked about this a number of different times. When we have a dependent clause, it has a subject and verb, but it also has a conjunction, a different type of conjunction, which some people call a dependent marker word. And that word ends up creating an unanswered question. As a result, it can't stand on its own as a complete thought. So we combine it with a simple sentence or an independent clause. And if it comes first, it has the comma. If it comes second, it does not. So let's have our example. Unless Ellen goes to work, comma, she will be fired. So Ellen goes to work. Ellen is our subject. Goes is our verb. That is followed by a comma. There's our dependent marker word, our our subordinating conjunction unless, and then she will be fired could be a sentence on its own. She is the subject and will be fired is our complete verb. Now, if we flip it, there's no comma. So, Ellen will be fired unless she goes to work. Same idea, just joined a little bit differently. We don't need that break or the pause when we end with the word fired before our conjunction. All right, so those are the ones that we've talked about so far. Let's talk about our next type, number 5. This rule can maybe be a tiny bit more tricky. And again, I think some of these I can explain to you how this works, the practice that you'll be doing, and then our look later at authentic materials can help you even more. So you use a comma after an introductory phrase. So what is that? Well, an introductory phrase is kind of like a clause, but it doesn't always have its own subject and verb. So up here where we just looked at this dependent clause, right? I said before, Ellen's our subject and goes to work would be our complete verb. I'm just going to put goes there in green. Okay, so that's a clause because it has both the subject and the verb. An introductory phrase doesn't always have that. Now, there are a lot of different types of these introductory phrases, and your book explains them pretty thoroughly. I don't want to get into all of them here because I don't think it's necessary to know all of the terms. What I find sometimes is when we look at every single term, it's kind of like when you're doing math and you know one formula instead of 8 that all do the same thing. So here is the idea of an introductory phrase. I'll give you a couple different examples. Here's our first example. Swimming across the ocean, comma. Nemo finally found his father. Okay, so we have this. And this does not, I think that this is a little bit of an awkward sentence, but this is how they're structured. I probably would have said Nemo finally found his father after swimming across the ocean, but if you want to word it this way. You'll notice that with this phrase, there's a verb, swimming, but it's not a complete verb, and there's no subject for that particular phrase. So because of that, and it comes at the beginning, it's going to have that comma after it. Let's do another ing verb. Running through the woods, the deer at last came to a pond. Okay, maybe it was thirsty. So again, that ing phrase, running through the woods, comma, the deer at last came to a pond to get a drink of water. All right. So comma after both of those. We have that verb. It's not complete. It's not a complete thought. So it has the comma after. Kind of similar, right, to this. Unless Ellen goes to work, has an unanswered question. It's not a complete thought, and it's followed by the comma to join it correctly. So let's do another one. This has a dependent clause word, but it doesn't have a subject or a verb, so it's kind of a different type of introductory phrase. After the dance, Kara went home, period. Okay, so our introductory phrase here, not a complete clause because it doesn't have a verb. It only has a subject, dance. After the dance, comma, Kara went home. It is joined correctly. It has the comma afterwards. Let's do another one. Beyond the terrible tunnel and through the depths of despair, the elves of Crinkle. It's telling me I spelled that wrong. The elves of Crinkle forge blades of steel. Let's make it gold. There we go. Okay. A little bit of a weird sentence, but I just wanted to have a longer one. Beyond the terrible tunnel and through. We have beyond and we have through, but we don't actually have a verb there. The terrible tunnel, the depths of despair. We have nouns, but no verbs. So that's our phrase. Introductory phrase, because it's coming first in the sentence. That's why it's introductory. And then we have our comma. Let's do one more that's maybe not quite so crazy. Without help, without the, I don't want to use that, sorry guys. Without the correct amount of change, I was unable to buy any candy at the store. I don't need candy anymore, but still. Okay, so has that introductory phrase. We have no verb there, so it's not a complete thought, and it's not a dependent clause either. And then we have our comma. And one last one. Unless, no. Before midnight, Cinderella fell in love with the prince. Okay, so we have another dependent word there, kind of like we did with after. Okay, it's not a dependent clause technically because it doesn't. It's not a dependent clause because it doesn't have a verb. It just has the word midnight, a subject word or a noun rather. So before midnight, comma, Cinderella fell in love with the prince. Now, similar to the previous examples with that dependent clause, again, you don't necessarily need to know these words, but just I want you to remember how they work. The dependent clause, right, when we flipped it, Ellen will be fired unless she goes to work, there was no comma. And that's basically what happens here too. So Cinderella fell in love with the prince before midnight. No comma. The elves of Crinkle forged blades of gold beyond the terrible tunnel and through the depths of despair. No comma there either if I were to flip that one, which I guess I will. There we go. And we'll copy and paste that in. Okay, it's no longer an introductory phrase because it doesn't come at the beginning, so there's no comma there. So what is another use for commas? Well, one of the things that you will be practicing are using commas in pairs to set aside non-essential information. What does that mean? Well, non-essential means not important, right? If a sentence were missing the non-essential information, it could still stand on its own as a complete thought. And we'll see what that looks like in a moment. Sometimes these are called parenthetical commas. Now, if you know what parenthetical is, you should if you're in my class, because we use parentheses. In-text citations are also called parentheticals, right? They come inside parentheses. So they look like this. They have like the author's last name and then the page, just as a reminder in case you forgot or we haven't done it yet. So that's what that looks like. So it kind of, it's necessary, right? But sometimes in a sentence, someone might write something like this. I'll give you the example without commas first. So he answered the door after 20 minutes because he did not want to come out of his room. Okay, so that is how the parentheses would work if we were going to use parentheses. The thing is that sometimes parentheses can be kind of distracting. So to set off that information, we're going to have the same sentence, except that we're going to use a pair of commas to set it off. Separate it out so it's not too confusing. Comma, after 20 minutes, comma. So this little part here, after 20 minutes, has a comma before, has a comma after. And look, if we wanted to, we could strike that right out. He answered the door because he did not want to come out of his room. It can still stand alone as a sentence, right? It's a complete thought. It's actually a complex sentence. We have an independent clause and a dependent clause. The thing is that then you're kind of, it's not as interesting of a sentence, I guess, because answering the door after 20 minutes is a little bit more interesting. So let's take that off and we'll do another example. The ship, which was in the harbor, had a hole in its sail. Okay, non-essential information about this ship. So if we crossed it out, the ship had a hole in its sail. There you go. Still makes sense as a sentence, right? But it's a little more interesting to know that it was in the harbor. So we're going to keep that in there. One more. Daniel, who is Fiona's brother, liked some of my social media posts. So if this person was talking to a friend, they wouldn't just be like, Daniel liked some of my social media posts. If they did, that would be a full, complete sentence, and that's fine. But then their friend might be like, who the heck is Daniel, and why do I care? So it would be better to be like, Daniel, who's Fiona's brother, he liked some of my social media posts. So hopefully you can kind of see how that works. Again, there's a number of different names for these things. I'm not sure if the practice tells you the names or if they just want you to kind of know how to do it. I don't think that knowing all of the different names for things are helpful, but if you want the terms parenthetical, a positive, there are participle phrases, prepositional phrases, infinitive phrases, that's with like to and then a verb. Verb phrases, noun phrases, there's lots of different kinds. But the important thing is knowing really just how to construct a sentence and where the punctuation needs to go so that people can understand what you're talking about. You can imagine if you had no commas here, there's no pause. I'm going to take off the highlighting. Right? Daniel, who is Fiona's brother, likes my post. Well, then brother is here, but it would be kind of confusing if you didn't set off that information. So it needs to be set off in that way. Let's do a fourth and then we'll move on. My dog, the best dog in the whole world, chewed through all my homework. Okay, so the best dog in the whole world is set apart by these two commas. And my dog chewed through my homework. again, would be a sentence in itself. My dog chewed through my homework. But we want to show how this person feels about their dog. So, my dog, the best dog in the whole world, chewed through all my homework. Maybe not the best dog in the whole world. Okay, so our last one here is commas should be used with quotation marks. Now, I have a whole other lecture about quotation marks, but I'm not sure if I'm going to put this one first or that one first. So if that one came first, this is review, and if this one comes first, then that one will be review. Either way, it'll be fine. So when we have quotation marks with dialogue or in an academic essay, when you are introducing research, a comma comes before what the person has to say. So that's our first use. So let's say we have our speech tag. That's who is doing the talking and how they're doing the talking. So if I have Janet shouted, comma, I love pizza, exclamation point. We have our comma here before the quote. Just to give another example. There we go. I'll give another example here. Bill whined, I don't want pizza. I want hamburgers. Okay, our speech tag is here. Bill whined tells us who's talking and how they're talking, comma, and then the quote. So that's how it happens when the speech tag is first. Sometimes the speech tag is in the middle. So you'll have a little bit of dialogue, a little bit of words being said or written, and then another piece. So this is done a little bit interestingly. If we have part of a sentence, we get the comma. So part of a sentence, I love, Mike paused, comma, this food. All right, so comma inside the quotes before the speech tag, and then we have a comma again before the second part of the quotation. So let's look at another example of that. Whenever I come to New York, Tina said, I always have bagels. I'm hungry right now if you can't tell. All right, so comma here before the end of the first part of the quote. Whenever I come to New York isn't a full sentence, right? So then we have a comma here before the second part. Now, as I've said in the quotations video, you don't have academic essays that often that have this setup, because you can kind of imagine that it would be difficult if I start a quote something like research shows, one author states, comma, that smoking is bad for your health. This isn't the best sentence, but it can be confusing because your reader may not know, how can I put this? If you are writing for a teacher, they will want to know that you are doing proper attribution. That means showing where your quotes are from. So you don't want to bury that attribution because you want to show that you're not plagiarizing. So I think that when you're first learning to write essays, having that tag at the beginning, showing who is writing, and helps to do that, helps you to not be in trouble for plagiarism. So same thing here. We can also have, I was going to say, okay, so if we have if we have a full sentence first, then we have a period inside the quotes. So it's a little bit different, okay? I'm going to give you an example. I should have separated it out somehow, but that's okay. Okay, so let's take this from here. Let's say I didn't split the sentence up. So research shows that smoking is bad for your health. Let's say I have a name here. Hollister Banks explains, comma, and then the rest of the quote. A new sentence. We found that, and then whatever they found. Okay. So here we have, because this is a full sentence, we have a period, but we still have a comma before the quotation. So to introduce that quote, you need the name and then a verb, or a pronoun and then a verb, like he said, she said, that kind of thing. And then the comma and then the quote. Okay. You can also have, if the speech tag is last, you again have a comma inside the quotations. So, I love pizza, Jenny said. No, I want hamburgers, her brother argued. Okay, the speech tag is at the end, but we have a comma that comes before it. All right. I realized now that I forgot to give you guys one more. So I have one more use for commas. Is that 7? Are we on 8? Yes, we're on 8. Okay, I should have put this before. I'm so sorry, you guys. So sometimes we have a comma after an introductory word. So we looked at introductory phrases and we looked at dependent clauses. Both of those come first. Sometimes, as in this sentence, we have one after an introductory word. So here are some examples. So, I see you had a nice time tonight, comma after the so. You can hear that a little bit, the pause. So, I see you had a nice time tonight, right? However, I had a horrible evening, comma after the however. Well, I hope you learned your lesson. These are some common ones that I'm giving you guys right now. A lot of people get these mixed up and they'll put a comma right after a dependent clause word, and that doesn't work. You can't have a pause there. So you can't say, after I went to the park. The after doesn't need a comma. It's after I went to the park, comma, I went to the store. No, I don't want to talk to you. Yes, I will have a cup of coffee. Okay, so those are how our commas work. Next time, what we're going to do is we're going to be in a Word document again, and we're going to go through I'm going to grab some examples from real life, and we'll just look at where the commas are placed, and we'll see if they are missing any. But to review, we have commas after introductory words. We also have them before quotation marks, and sometimes before speech tags if that speech tag is in the middle. So make sure you're punctuating those correctly. Again, if I went too fast, this is in your book. We use commas as well to set off non-essential information. And groups of words that describe the noun right before it. So here this describes the ship. Who is Fiona's brother describes Daniel. Other times, after 20 minutes, describes how he answered the door. So all of those are groups of words that don't have to be in the sentences, but they are to make the sentence a little bit easier. But you can set them off by commas to show that they're not essential to the sentence structure. We also use commas after dependent clauses, as we talked about before. And let's go up. At before fanboys conjunctions. And in between items in a list. So I hope that you learned a little bit of something about commas today, and I hope that this sets you up to be able to do some of that practice. The book pages that I've assigned will reinforce these ideas, so you can look through those as well. I know I went a little bit fast today. And then next time we're going to look at authentic materials to see what this looks like in real life. So